So I can see messages. My thanks to Phil Tooley, who's going to, for the first time ever, try to set up the breakout groups today. So he'll have fun doing that. I'm just meeting a couple of people who've come in a little late. There we go. All right.
My
So
apologies, Paul. I had Windows decided it needed an update at the worst time possible.
no problem. That's always the way that that happens. Okay. So if anybody comes in, if they can make sure they're muted, that would be great. So welcome. Part two of the 2024 BGA Fertile course. We had a good session last time. Hopefully this will be good too. It's the pace is picking up a little bit. It's a bit like MasterChef, which I've been watching recently. You get the easy one the first week, and then it gets a little bit more tricky. So, what are we going to do? As normal, we're going to talk about some key messages from this week, and don't forget that the material we'll be going through tonight is not the full amount of material. You definitely need to look at the material on the website, the video lectures and the other things that that points to. That's got it in depth. What we're going to do here is pick out a few of the key messages. But the main thing that we're going to be doing tonight is practice. And we've got a couple of scripts that you can work on, which are the sort of things that you would do on an average cross-country glider flight anywhere near any air traffic service unit. So what are the key messages that we're going to have a look at? Well, we're going to review the initial and full messages that we looked at last week. They're the core of what we do when we're in the air. We're going to talk about call signs. They can be a bit tricky. So how do we address the ground station we're talking to, and how are they going to address us? In the UK, it's a bit more complicated than the average European country or the US. We have three different types of, perhaps even more, three different types of controller, to use a broad term, but air traffic service unit that we might talk to as glider pilots. And we really need to know the differences. And certainly if you're going to do the test, you need to know the differences, but actually out there in the real world, you need to know the differences too. And then we're going to talk about what needs to be read back. That's some of the rules that you'll have seen in the material you've already looked at. But it's quite helpful to know your way around that. All right, so the initial message. It's their call sign, my call sign, and my request. Really quite easy. So how do we know what their call sign is? Well, we can listen in first. That's a really good way. So before talking, being on the airfield frequency and listening to other people talking and them talking back, that will help you with their call sign. We can ask other people. If you go past Cranfield, what would you use as their call sign? If you go past Cambridge, what would you use as their call sign? We can look at the flight guides, SkyDemon or various others. If you subscribe to the airfields and landouts information, generally the call sign is in the notes for anybody you might talk to. Or we can look at the AIP, the Air Information Publication, which is the theoretically, at any rate, the definitive answer to this. Maybe not always, but it's a good place to go and look. So if you Google NATS, National Air Traffic Services, Air Information Service, Electronic Air Information Publication, which is what that lot stands for, and have a look at part 2, you can find information about different places that you might fly past. What's the request going to be? Well, it's going to depend on what we're trying to do. It might be enter your zone or air traffic zone to thermal. It might be request join, which means we want to go and land there. It might be for a zone transit or a max penetration. If we're just going past the right sort of place, we'll probably ask for a basic service or some variation on that, like a basic service to cross your extended center line to give them a clue as to what we want. What you shouldn't do is call them and say no service required, because all the basic service is we call them, they tell us anything that's important, we tell them where we are, and we tell them when we're going to leave the frequency. And it's much quicker to say basic service than to explain that all of that's what you want. I hear people doing that occasionally, and I'm sitting there tearing my hair out while it happens. So don't say no service required. If you're calling them, probably if you don't have anything very specific to say to ask for, what you want is a basic service. And certainly in the exam, should you do it, you're definitely going to want to ask for probably a basic service. Okay, a logistics thing. Coaches, please make sure you have a star in front of your name. Then Phil is able to set up the breakout groups. If you don't have a star in front of your name, you won't get into a group. If you struggle for some reason to get a star in front of your name, interrupt me and we'll try and sort it out. Okay. Katrina asks, would we ever prefer to ask for a basic service if a traffic service is available? If so, why? Let me just deal with that one while I can. There's a couple of questions on the basic service I just said, and I'll deal with them. If we're a glider and we don't have a transponder, we're probably not going to be able to get a traffic service. So generally, most gliders don't have transponders, so it's basic service. Likewise, if we're talking to a non-radar unit, it's basic service. They can't provide a traffic service. But actually, I fly a glider with a transponder, and I very, very rarely ask for a traffic service, largely because our behavior as glider pilots is if we see another glider circling, we go towards it. We're not trying to stay away from it. And to ask for a traffic service under those circumstances is quite demanding, I think, of the air trafficker. In the test, and we'll come to that later, we might ask for a traffic service. The time when I might ask for a traffic service, if I'm in a glider, is if I go into cloud. And then if I'm on a frequency with a radar service, I'll ask them to tell me about traffic. And then Jim Williams asks about if you're a ground radio operator at a club, and I'm going to touch on this. So there are certain types of air traffic service unit which can't provide a basic service, and we'll come to that. And certainly, if you're talking on the radio on the ground at a club, you can't provide a basic service. So the word that you would just use is unable if somebody asked you. Right. So here's what we're going to do. I want you to think about this problem. We're flying a glider. We're going from Little Rislington here to Upper Heyford and back, and we're about here. Here's Oxford, and they have an approach. So it's Oxford approach, and we're flying this glider, Golf Delta Echo Echo Juliet. And the QNH is 1017, and we're whatever level you like. What's your initial message going to be? If you've got a piece of paper there, just write down your initial message for me. Okay, hopefully not too hard. It's their call sign, Oxford approach. our call sign, Glider Golf Delta Echo Echo Juliet, and our request basic service. That's it. And they're going to say, Glider Golf Delta Echo Echo Juliet, pass your message. So the sequence is our initial message, they say pass your message, we give them the full message, they respond, and then we read some stuff back. So this first bit is basically just to get their attention and check that they are ready to talk to us. The second bit is where we tell them most of what we want. We've already told them why we're calling. They respond with some things, and we read the important bits back. So, okay, so we've done that. They've said pass your message, and now you've got to give them the full message. So can you write out for me on your piece of paper in front of you, or think about it in your head, your full message? Let's have a look at that. So we only use their call sign once, so now we start with our call sign, and we haven't abbreviated it yet. So Glider Golf Delta Echo Echo Juliet. Little Rislington to Little Rislington, that's where we're going from and to. Our position and level, 2 miles south of Enstone, altitude 2,600 feet, QNH 1017. And then something else that might be useful. In this case, because we've given them the same place that we're from and to, and we're not going A to B, we'll tell them where we're going right now. So the next turning point, Upper Heyford Disused Airfield. So there it is. Glider Golf Delta Echo Echo Juliet, Little Rislington to Little Rislington, 2 miles south of Enstone, altitude 2,600 feet, QNH 1017. Next turning point, Upper Heyford Disused Airfield. And what I want you to get in your mind is that framework. And then you can plug in the facts, which are going to be different every time, relatively easily. So if you get used to talking about your position in 3 dimensions, where you're going, the from to, and your call sign, that becomes much easier rather than trying to make everything up. And the controller's response to the full message typically is going to contain this sort of thing. May well tell you what their QNH is, certainly if it's different, or they might tell you you're correct if you've given them the correct one. They'll respond to your request for a service and tell you basic service, traffic service, whatever. There might be, depending on who you're talking to, clearances or permissions, approvals, restrictions. The only people you're going to get clearances from are full air traffic control units who are giving you clearances to operate in controlled airspace. Pretty much everything else will be an approval. And they may have a request or a question for you. You respond to that by reading back the required elements, and you conclude with your glider call sign. So most messages which you initiate are going to have your call sign on the front. Responses where you're doing readbacks have your call sign on the end. And the readback items, and you'll have seen the lists in the materials that hopefully you've already studied, but here's an acronym that might be useful, CRAS, and it's clearances. So anything with a clearance needs to be read back exactly. And then the important stuff that might kill somebody if they get it wrong, which runway people are on, anything about altitudes and altimeter settings, the service type, and squawks if they're asking you to squawk a particular code. Couple of questions on the way. Would you ever refer, Nij asks, would you ever refer to your position relative to the air traffic zone, 3 miles north, for example, 3 miles north of Oxford zone, or better to base it on the core, which I think by which he means the city. So 4 mile north of Oxford. Yeah, quite often you can talk to them in terms of where you are in relation to them. If you're going to use the word Oxford, it's probably good to be specific about whether you mean Oxford Airfield or Oxford City, though. That could be a source of confusion. And Brian says, pre-inflation ATC will generally expect you to set and report your altitude/height if they give you a pressure setting, for example, QNH. And yes, that's broadly right. Mostly we fly around on QNH. We'll talk a little bit about some of the exceptions, but occasionally you'll get for example, a military, if you go across the top of a military airfield, they will ask you to set and report on their QFE, but they're quite specific about it. And then we have the nightmare of regional pressure settings, which again we'll talk about later. Okay, so I think a good time to ask for any other questions on that. We've just run through quite a lot of stuff. Anybody have anything they want to either stick in the chat or just say out loud? Dax asked, what is a squawk? So lots of aircraft and some gliders have a thing called a transponder, which shows up on air traffic radar screens if they have a radar. And the squawk is the word we use for the 4-digit code that we put into that unit. We'll talk again, it's something we'll talk about later. But it means that when I'm flying my glider, if they say squawk 4357, I put 4357 into the unit, and on their radar display, they get 4357. Steve asked, would I need permission or clearance to cross an ILS? No, not if it's in Class G, is the answer to that. If you are trying to fly through a piece of controlled airspace, so Class D, then yes, you would absolutely need permission.
Paul, in the exam, in the practical test, you're going to be using a half mil map.
Yes.
With a predetermined course on it. So when you're making the response to the initial call, you're obviously giving your route, your position, etc. That to some extent is subjective rather than objective. Will it be very specific, or is there? So some people may say 3 miles southwest of Wooler, or they might say X miles north of so and so. Would you be expected to pick specific locations, or is it down to interpretation?
You need to, I think this is more than just the exam. You need to communicate with the air traffic controller with language that they will understand. And generally, they will know the features on a 500,000, most of them, not all of them. We're going to talk about the Americans later. They will know the features on a 500,000 map are local to them. Mm-hmm. And they will know where they are. So if you use your position relative to largish towns, or them, so 5 miles southwest of Cranfield Airfield, then you're good. What isn't sensible is if, for example, you give them a next turning point, which is a BGA waypoint 100 kilometers away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because who knows where that is, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So in that case, I would say tracking northwest or something. So you're trying to communicate with the air traffic controller in a way that they will understand, so that they have situational awareness of you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. So I've got a few other questions as we go. Is there a procedure to ask the station to identify themselves if we're unsure about frequency and nobody is talking? Yes. So in general, we know what frequency we have called. Otherwise, we won't be making blind transmissions on it. But we might not know the specifics. So if I call Cambridge, for example, I don't know whether there's a radar guy working that day. So I don't know whether they're Cambridge Approach or Cambridge Radar. So I might just say Cambridge, or I might go with Cambridge Approach. And if it's the radar guy, he will say Glider 28, Cambridge Radar. And I'll know then it's Cambridge Radar. So if you use the wrong thing, they will correct you, and just listen for that. John asks if you change squawk codes, do you generally need to go to standby while changing? No, not with a modern transponder. It used to be that you used to do that, but you don't anymore. Where would a call sign student be acceptable or usable? Asks Elliot. It's available. If you're a student and not a qualified pilot, then you can use the word student as part of your call sign. Actually, the way that gliding works, you're probably going to be a qualified pilot by the time you're doing any cross country. So, but you could still use it, I guess.
That will change with SPL.
Yes, because you will. Well, I think it's true now. I mean, bronze in cross country is what we call a qualified pilot. So, we get very few people doing much in the way of cross country if they don't have bronze cross country. So, you're probably not a student. John says, my transponder says my comp number. Should I therefore use that as opposed to the full reg? Okay, so that's one of the differences that I'm going to talk about later, and I might have a slide on it coming up. So does my transponder. In the real world, we tend to use glider call signs, which are our comp number. And if we're going to do that, and it works well, then that's what the transponder will say. We must use the same call sign as our transponder says. For the test and all of the rest of this course, we're going to use our GREG call signs because that's required for the test. Okay. Will the practical test be online or on paper? Neither. It's face-to-face with an examiner. There's a theoretical test, which is 12 questions, which is on paper. Again, it'll be face-to-face with the paper. Arjun, how soon should you contact ATC? I'll talk about that in a moment. Sarah asks, is it best to say next turn point or tracking to? If I'm going to use the actual place, because I think they'll understand it, I'll say next turn point. If I'm going in a direction, I'll tend to say tracking to, but I'm not sure it matters terribly much. Okay, great. Lots of stuff there. Oh, another one. David, if you don't have a transponder, can you in the real world use your comp number instead of the G number? Yes, in the real world you can, not for the exam. Tom asked if there's a general rule of thumb as to how far out you change to their frequency and make contact. Giving them time to do stuff, so maybe 5 or 10 minutes before you get there. There are some rules. They're not written for gliders. I will teach you what the rule is, and in the real world, we'll do it slightly differently. Any comprehensive examples of the written paper, says Nidge. Yes, if you look on the website, I've got a whole bunch of examples of the sorts of questions in there. They're not the actual questions, but and if you go through all the material that we provide you, you will be able to answer those questions, the actual questions. Is the practical test compulsory, says Maya? Nope, you can do this course and not do the test. You won't get a license to use the radio. You will understand how to use the radio though. Right, which website? The course website. ruskin.me.uk, Fertile course. If you just Google BGA Fertile course, you will find it. Right, let's move on. Let's talk a little bit about what different ATSUs can do. And by ATSU, I mean an air traffic service unit. That's the generic word we give to things that we might otherwise call air traffic control. And that's because air traffic control is the top level of these. So bigger airfields have full air traffic controllers, and they are called controllers, and they're going to be looking after an air traffic zone or some Class D airspace or a military air traffic zone, which is the bigger 5 to 10 mile thing that we'll have a look at in a moment. And they could be in Class D, they could be in Class G. You're going to know what they are because they're going to have call signs like tower or approach or radar or zone. And they can give you clearances, instructions, and they can do all the services, basic service, traffic service, and the others. There are 4. If you're in Class G, you don't have to do what they say. They can't actually control you. But if you go into their air traffic zone or you go into some controlled airspace with a clearance, then they can control you. So you're going to negotiate what you're going to do and what they're going to let you do. The next one down is a thing called an airfield flight information service. And the person who runs that is called a flight information safety officer, I think, might be service operator. They're at smaller airfields. So they're places that might have an air traffic zone, and they can talk to you outside that, maybe up to about 10 nautical miles away. And they're going to be places like Coventry, maybe not Sywall, Fenland possibly. I'm trying to think of some. Shoreham is another one. And their call sign is something information. So Coventry information would tell you that this is an airfield flight information service. They can give you information and they can give you a basic service. They can't tell you what to do in the air. They can tell you what to do on the ground. It doesn't make much difference for us as glider pilots. But if you're flying a TMG or something, they can tell you whether you can taxi and things like that. And then the last one, almost, is the air-ground operator. They're providing an air-ground communications service. And again, they're at small airfields and up to 10 miles away. So Shobden Radio, Sywall Radio, places like that, Fenland Radio probably, Conington Radio. And they can only give you information. This isn't terribly much use, but they can give you information about the airfield. They can't give you a basic service, so don't ask for one. They'll just say unable. Adrian has given me the right answer. It's Flight Information Service Officer. Thank you, Adrian. So that's what they can do. If we're going to talk to an air ground station, they can't give us a service, but what we can do is use the words request airfield information. And if the exam-friendly way of that is going to look like, they'll say, pass your message, you pass the full message telling them what you're doing, and you can expect them to tell you what runway they're on, what their QNH is, and any traffic that's in the vicinity. So it can be useful if I'm going past in my glider somewhere like Conington, which is near just south of Peterborough. I will be on frequency listening out from 5 to 10 miles away to listen for any traffic. And if I think it might be useful if they know where I am, I'll give them a call, tell them exactly where I am, what I'm doing. They'll tell me this information, and I'll need to read back to them the runway, the QNH, and the actually, I don't need to read back traffic. Sorry, that's wrong. You might get from your initial call the runway, the QNH, and the traffic, in which case you read back the runway, the QNH, not the traffic. And you could, if you wanted to, add some information about you. So air-ground communication operators tend to be less well trained than the other guys, so you could easily get either of these things. I thought we'd touch on how you'd leave a frequency, because that's sort of useful. And we'll do it in the breakouts. So this can happen a number of ways. The controller might suggest strongly that you should change frequency if they want to get rid of you. And they can do that in two ways. They can say, for example, contact, use the word contact, so BigJet 347, contact rating control 129.125, to which the response is rating control 129.125, BigJet 347. So here's the read back, who we're going to and what the frequency is. and our call sign goes on the end. And this contact means that they have talked on the telephone to Raytheon Control, and they have passed your details. So when you call Raytheon, all you need to do is turn up with your call sign and your altitude. And if you've got a transponder, they will know exactly where you are, and the service will continue uninterrupted. Oops, sorry. Unlikely to happen in the glider, frankly. More commonly, what you'll get is this: Golf Kilo Sierra or glider Kilo Sierra. If we were a glider, free call SIWAL information 122.705. SIWAL information 122.705. Golf Kilo Sierra. So it's a response with our call sign on the end. And free call means they haven't passed any information to the other air traffic service unit. So when you call, it's like it's a fresh call. So you're going to have to start again with your initial call and then your full call. So that's the way the controller might initiate stuff. They might say, if they've got you on radar, they might say clear of my area, free. What would be the word? Approved to leave. Frequency change approved. Frequency change approved would be a frequent thing for them to say. Or we can say we want to go. And there's a few ways of doing that. We can say, for example, glider Charlie Delta changing to Laken Heath radar 128.9. Or we could say glider Charlie Delta request change to Laken Heath radar. And the response to either of those will probably be frequency change approved. Or we can just say glider Charlie Delta leaving the frequency. Most of the power world will do one of these two things here, because they're used to stepping from one air traffic service unit to the next. But in gliders, we quite often just drop back to one of our chat frequencies, or maybe just turn the radio off or down. Yeah. So this last one is easy, and I use it quite a lot. Leaving the frequency. You'll occasionally hear change en route, which means the same thing, but it's not so good for the exam. So we'll just use leaving the frequency as far as this is concerned. Okay, let's pick up any questions. Anthony asks, can an AFIS provide a traffic service? No, certainly not. Traffic service is a radar service. Basically, the air traffic service unit, so the air traffic control will have you on radar because you've got a transponder. It'll detect other people and they will call traffic to you if they think it might have some effect. They will call traffic within quite big bounds. So you might get the call at 3 miles and it's going to pass a mile away and 1,000 feet different or something. So not much use to us as glider pilots, frankly. Peter asks, might air traffic also give surface wind? And yes, they might. Thank you. Jim says, can putting traffic in the response be useful if it's an eyes on a close aircraft? I'm not quite sure what that means. I think it's if you see somebody, should you tell air traffic about it? You wouldn't normally. It's not a threat to you if you've seen it.
It was the part that you said about if they've told you about traffic in the area and not to repeat traffic back to them. I was just curious if there was an aircraft that was close to you that they had mentioned. Is it the proper thing to do to reply, okay, call sign of that aircraft, eyes on, to let them know you're aware of the danger?
Okay, I understand you. So if they tell you about traffic, so glider Charlie Delta, traffic Cessna 172, in your 12 o'clock at 2 miles, 500 feet above, then the response should either be traffic in sight or traffic not sighted. And if you think it's a threat and you see it a little later, you might call them and say traffic sighted. So yeah, you might. That's a good response. Thank you. George points out that VRPs on the chart might be useful for positions. Yes, absolutely. Knowing where the VRPs are for a given airfield that you're passing is quite useful. William asks, will air traffic control respond to leaving the frequency? Yes, absolutely, and you shouldn't until they have. You don't just say and go. You wait until you get a response, and then you go. Yeah. So Tom, same question. Arjun asks, what's the demarcation between information and basic service? I'm not sure I understand that one, Arjun. What do you mean by information? David says, do you say glider Charlie Delta leaving the frequency when you've exited their airspace? Yeah, that's a possible way of leaving the frequency. If it's airspace like controlled airspace, you'd probably wait for a positive response out of a positive suggestion out of them. John says, can we ask for weather? Absolutely. I might do that if I'm coming back from a long cross country, as I'm going past Cranfield, 20, 30k away from Gransden, I might ask them for their surface wind, for example. That can be quite a useful thing to know. Andy says, if you've got a Sky Echo or similar but can't squawk, what do you do? And the answer is nothing. A Sky Echo doesn't show up on anybody's radar. Chris nudges me about abbreviated call signs as gliders. It's all in the material, but thank you. So, as you will have seen from the material that hopefully you've looked at, we will abbreviate call signs, and we do that after the air traffic service unit has abbreviated it. So we don't start using an abbreviated call sign until they've done it. Generally, they will use our call sign twice before abbreviating it, so that they know that we're right, or that they're right. And if we're using glider plus our Golf reg, so in my case it would be glider Golf Charlie Lima Oscar November, the abbreviated form of that is glider plus the last two letters, so glider Oscar November. So in all the work that you do, in all the breakouts and for the exam, move between glider Golf Charlie Lima Oscar November and glider Oscar November. Katrina asks, do we need to read weather information? No, we do not. Nidj asks, would you add direction as well as leaving the frequency, departing northwest or whatever? They should know what direction you're going in because you've already told them that, so no, I wouldn't. I might say something like, clear to the west, request leave the frequency, or cross the N1, request leave the frequency, something like that to give them a clue as to why I'm leaving the frequency. I'm out of their zone. Okay, Chris says, if you look at slide 36 where it says free call, is it Golf Kilo Sierra or should it be glider Kilo Sierra? The example we've got there, Chris, is a TNG, and that was actually Golf Kilo Sierra, not a glider. So I've taken the example from a powered version. If we were flying a glider, it would be glider Kilo Sierra. James says, if you change direction once under a basic service, should you tell air traffic? No. The basic service is just talking to each other. If I was going to do something wildly different, like turn around and go in the other direction, rather than fly through their ILS, I might tell them. So it depends on the contract I've got with them, but you don't have to keep them informed as to exactly where you are.
Paul, one of the things I've really picked up from the materials you've given is during your call, use the beginning gliders. So you constantly tell the service provider that you are a glider rather than a powered aircraft.
Yeah, I think that's a really useful thing to do because we behave differently. And Bruce says they won't know your height as you're leaving, so it's sometimes useful to pass that. Yes, that's right, Bruce, it is. So we don't operate like the average powered aircraft, which will stay on a heading going at a level and will stay there as they pass through. So for the benefit of the air traffic controller and everybody else on frequency, starting your call sign with glider is really good. John says, would it be useful to let them know we have a turbo? Not normally. Wouldn't bother. If I'm going to do an engine start, then yes. So, I mean, for example, last season, I spent about an hour trying to battle into a 20-knot headwind with overcast just south of Cambridge, and I was in and out of their ATZ, and they were really helpful. And I was switching between radar and tower a couple of times, and they were routing traffic around me. But I gave them a clue as to what I was doing, which was basically, I'm going to try and do this, and if it doesn't work, I will start the engine. And they're used to us starting engines, and so will you lose comms when you start the engine? In my case, no, but it was a good question. But normally, no, I wouldn't bother telling them I've got a turbo. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say. Lots of good questions there. Last chance for questions. David says, if you're trusting but come across a really good thermal, do you need to ask air traffic control before thermaling? I don't know what trusting means. So no, not normally. Normally, the deal is with gliders that they should expect gliders to make heading changes within 20 or 30 degrees of track and to stop and thermal. And in general, any negotiation we've done about what we're going to do will include that. Thank you. Transiting, perhaps. And that's even if we're going through a piece of Class D or a MAX or something. So we don't ask to stop and thermal. What we might get is some altitude limitations, which if we're going to brake, we ought to tell them early. Because they might say, can you stay above 2,000 feet, say? And my response is generally, I will try. Not yes or no, but I will try. And then if I'm going to break 2,000 feet, I will let them know. Okay. Right, good. So I'm going to give the breakout brief, just a check with Phil that we are okay to go to breakouts when we get there. Not yet, but all right, I'll let him think about that.
Sorry. Yeah, just about as you said that, I was having a last check. I've realised one of our coaches seems to have dropped out.
Okay.
But give me, I think, 1 minute.
That's fine. I need to talk about. I've got a couple of slides to talk to, so that's fine. Right. So the breakout, we're going to practice some of that stuff, and as you see, it's just got a bit more complicated. So I want you to practice calls to an air ground service, getting airfield information, and a full air traffic control service, and ask for a basic service. And then you can look at leaving the frequency, and if your coaches are happy with it, they can maybe deal with QNH differences and changes to QNH and such like. If you run out of things to do in your groups, then have a go at asking to enter the ATZ to thermal. Maybe dealing with some reported traffic from Oxford. And the response, as I mentioned earlier, is either traffic in sight or traffic not sighted. So quite a good bunch of things to do here. But actually, this would get you through an awful lot of cross-country flights, being able to do this set of things. So we've got a long way in 2 weeks. Don't parrot from the script. We've given you scripts, but they're there so that you can see what the language is like. Rather learn the structure and practice with some different examples. I've got a note here from last year that the script has a Brownston Lodge in it, and it probably should be Little Rissington to Little Rissington, but so don't parrot the script. Use the right things. And what we've got is it's our Little Rissington to Upper Hayford, and you've got Enstone here that you're going to pass, and you've got Oxford, you've got an ILS, that you might pass through. So there's lots that you could do as we were doing that sort of flight. Okay, next week we're going to be looking in more detail about types of air traffic control service. We're going to be looking at crossing zones. So the examples we just looked at on the previous slide are all about doing things in Class G, where you don't have to ask permission. But next week we're going to be looking at places where you definitely have to ask permission, Class D, and places where it's at least polite to ask permission, and that's a military air traffic zone. We're going to be looking at how we might land out as an airfield. So having the ability to use the radio is pretty good when we want to land out. We're going to be talking about transponders, and we're going to talk about dealing with the Americans because they do it a little bit differently sometimes. So there's lots of stuff to learn.